Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started in just one more minute. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give folks just about one more minute, and then we'll get started with today's webinar. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the next edition of our Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series. And today we're talking about blue carbon in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm Stephanie Simpson, Blue Carbon Program Director at Restore America's Estuaries. And on behalf of our presenters and our staff at RAE, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Before we begin the presentation, I have a few announcements. For sound and only mode. If you're having any issues or technical problems, you can press *0 for assistance. We are also recording this session and on our webpage at estuaries.org/bluecarbon following the webinar session. Following our presentations, we'll have a moderated Q&A. So at any point during the webinar, you can enter a question into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll work to answer as many questions as possible following the webinar. If we don't get to your question, feel free to email us, as the contact information for all of our speakers will be listed at the end of the webinar. For those new to this webinar series, this is part of Restore America's Estuaries Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series. Quick background on who we are. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of our bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. In this effort, we lead an alliance of 10 conservation organizations located across the U.S. coast. We also convene a biannual national summit on coastal management and restoration, and lead a number of national programs, including Blue Carbon. You can find more information on any of these on our website at estuaries.org. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our webinar speakers today. As I mentioned before, my name is Stephanie Simpson, and I'll be serving as your webinar host and moderator today. I'm excited to be joined by two blue carbon researchers today as they share their research on blue carbon habitats of the Gulf of Mexico. Our speakers include Dr. Anitra Thorhaug. She is a practitioner and restoration ecophysiology researcher at the Sustainable Forestry Institute at Yale University's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Anitra was trained as a biological oceanographer at the University of Miami and Stanford, and much of her experience is with nearshore tropical and subtropical estuarine and coastal systems, especially seagrass, mangroves, in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. Her focus has been to find solutions to anthropogenic disturbances and destruction of tropical marine habitats in order to sustain their services. And Anitra is joined by Dr. Jorge Lopez-Portillo, who is a plant physiologist working in mangrove studies along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. He's an investigator nacional nivel at ENACOL in Mexico. He investigated mangrove anthropogenic disturbances versus structure and architecture of the forest, especially their salinity and biological services along the Veracruz and Tamaulipas coast. He is author of over 70 articles internationally and 7 books, including Mexican mangroves and sand dunes of the Gulf of Mexico. His biophysical, physiological studies include water relations, salinity relations and gradients, and solutions to anthropogenic disturbances. I'm very excited to have both Anitra and Jorge joining us today to talk to us about blue carbon in the Gulf of Mexico. So at this time, I'm going to pass control over to Anitra to get us started. So Anitra, if you will place yourself off mute, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Obviously, you can see my screen, which says blue carbon in the Gulf of Mexico. And after we did a large seagrass around the Gulf of Mexico, we became very interested in what participation the mangroves and the marshes had. So,
Anitra,
I
I'm
have
just going to
something
pause
on
you
my
for a
screen.
second because we're not seeing
Yes.
your slides yet.
No? Are you seeing them now?
Nope. There should be a pop-up on your screen.
Show screen.
There we go. Yes, now we can
Is
see
that
your
it?
slide.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. The Gulf of Mexico was a very interesting place because it, so now it isn't behaving itself and giving me the next slide. What do you suppose? Do I not have it in slide mode?
It looks like it's in slide mode. If you'll try clicking on the, there you go.
There
now
we
it's
go.
changed. Perfect.
There we go. So the most important thing is, where does the carbon come from that the plants in the Gulf of Mexico have to work with? Well, first of all, there is a huge equatorial Atlantic current that goes very lightly through the outer Antilles and comes through the Yucatan Straits and goes clockwise around the Gulf of Mexico, bringing heat and a lot of dissolved carbon into the Mexican peninsula. Of course, you all know that Yucatan was an island floating in the Caribbean that suddenly bumped into Mexico before the lower part of North America threw up its central corridor down to South America. It's a dynamic area. And second, it has the Mississippi River and many other rivers in many places, including from the Appalachians as well as from the Mexican mountains, that give a lot of carbon to the area. But before I talk about the rivers, I want to talk about the oceans. The oceans, supposedly, from an oceanographic point of view, contain 93% of carbon dioxide, especially excess. And a lot of this carbon dioxide goes in at the high latitudes and is released in the upwelling of the mid-Atlantic, mid-Pacific, etc., equatorial currents, and carried by the Coriolis over to the continents. And there are about 50 times more carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean than in the atmosphere, is the oceanographic estimate, and 19 times more than in the terrestrial. So we're going to do a quick overview of the blue carbon, which is facilitated in its deposition from the atmospheric, the oceanic carbon dioxide into the sediments. The atmospheric, of course, carries dust, particularly from North Africa, which comes down, adding carbon into the entire basin of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. But we have new carbon studies here, and one is all of the GEF, United Nations grant to Mexico on mangroves and blue carbon, and another is the seagrass around the Gulf, including the loss. There were two stimulatory events, and one was the oil spill, which really stimulated salt marsh research in the upper part of the Gulf of Mexico, where so much of the oil was spilled by the BP Macondo spill. So here's the watershed, which is almost 10,000 kilometers. It's the biggest watershed in North America, of course, going from all the way in Canada, all the way down through Mexico and a part of Guatemala. And so it's a basin which accumulates more than anything else and has accumulated over a long period of time when this was the Tethys Sea. David Buttman has done a large project and found that the amount of carbon coming in to the Gulf of Mexico is 26.7 teragrams per year, which is about twice what comes into the eastern seaboard, as an example. This is the best example of where the watershed is. So here is the outline of the watershed, and you'll see that there are many, many rivers not necessarily flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. So Buttman's estimate for the Gulf is 26.7. His estimate for the eastern seaboard is 15.4. So what comes in through the rivers? Well, forest carbon, for one thing. There are huge Appalachian and southern U.S. forests. There are Mexican forests, including the Yucatan forests, and then farmland and the soil. They say Iowa has lost 50% of its soil to the watershed, but this is a map of agriculture in the United States, and you see the dense and intense part of agriculture where a lot of soil is being lost is in the central plains, which is the watershed. This is a distribution map done by Gail Chamorro and Fred Short of red being mangroves. You see that in the southern latitudes, and you see the mangroves up to the southern part of Texas and very dense throughout Mexico, including Yucatan. The yellow is the marsh, and the blue is the seagrass. So the seagrass is a particular all over, ubiquitous throughout, but the marsh is in the upper half and the mangroves are in the lower half. So let's talk about seagrasses. There's a new method that we used for measuring carbon, and what we did is we went to areas where I had done restorations, and we measured the natural seagrass bed proximate to the restoration, the restored seagrass bed, and then we measured an area that was always barren. We got that from aerial history, and an area that I had not restored when I did my seagrass restoration, and we found an equation which gave us loss. Of course, we had exact dates for when the seagrass was destroyed or impacted and when it was restored. So we have loss and we have the number of years that included. And here's one of our sets of measurements. This is the restored seagrass, which we were very surprised was much more effulgent in carbon than the natural seagrass. We would have thought the natural seagrass was much more. But no, in many places, the restored seagrass was double the natural seagrass. This is a polluted barren where it had been impacted at the same time that the restored area had been impacted, but this was not restored and this was restored. And this is natural and naturally barren. And you can see that each estuary in the Gulf of Mexico had its own level of carbon, depending, of course, on what had come in through the rivers as well as what was blowing around the estuary itself. And that was interesting in and of itself. But what we found is that the loss of carbon was about 20 megagrams per hectare, and the gain was about 20 megagrams per hectare, and the loss was about 20 also. So, and that is not per year, but that's over a period of a decade. So there were variable losses by different impact types. And it was clear that there was more loss when there was more impact than the natural seagrass. And what we have in the extents of the seagrass around the Gulf of Mexico is about 94,000 hectares in Texas and about 12,000 in combined Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama estuaries, and Florida, which has two shelf extents at the Big Bend as well as on the Florida shelf extending out into the GOM, is about 850 hectares, and Mexico, according to Chamorro and Short, is about 25,000. But Herrera Silvera has now, and collaborators, said that he thinks there's 650 hectares only in Yucatan. So, number one, we're expecting numbers to change as more investigations happen. And number two, we understand that some of these are, when it's turbid, are much less well documented than others. The Florida and Texas happen to be extremely well documented, as are the Louisiana ones in the Chandeleur by Larry Handley. So these are the carbon amounts, and you see that Texas has a goodly amount, but Florida has most of the carbon, the Florida seagrasses, in the Gulf of Mexico. So here are the seagrasses, and the U.S. has the extent of about 950,000 hectares and has about 182 teragrams of carbon, whereas Mexico has about 25,000, which may change, and 2.8 teragrams, making the total 184. Salt marshes are a different kettle of different fish, because salt marshes, of course, are one thing, and they sequester a great amount of carbon down into the sediment. But the brackish and the freshwater marshes, which are particularly extensive in Louisiana, have been calculated by Hansen and Nesselrod in 2014, as well as Baustian and the Moss group in the 2016-2017, to have extensive total, and 3.1 teragrams per year are put down by the salt marshes into the Louisiana itself, just Louisiana, not Texas, Florida, etc. So this is the mother lode, Louisiana is, for a series of reasons, including the Gulf of Mexico flows over many millennia of the marshes in the Gulf of Mexico. What we were able to find is that there's about 500 and close to 550 hectares of salt marsh, most of which is in Louisiana and some of which is in northern Florida, down to about Crystal River and Anclot. Texas has about 32,000 hectares and is planting a lot of increasing their salt marshes. In terms of the carbon stock, Louisiana has by far the largest carbon stock, and Florida about a third of the Louisiana stock. Mexico does not have a high number of marshes, nor does it have a high stock. And this is being done by three Mexican investigators, Lopez-Portillo group and the Adame group and the Kaufman and Silvera group. So here we're looking at the total GOM extent, and I'm getting ahead of myself because Jorge is going to talk to you about his excellent mangrove research. but the salt marshes and the mangroves are somewhat similar, and the seagrasses are about double that, making about totally close to 2 million hectares. Now, I have to tell you right off that we've looked at the loss data, and everyone has the same opinion and estimate that in the 1800s, there were probably double the amount of extent of these three groups, and there could be much more for both salt marsh and mangroves. But what we have now is about 468 teragrams of carbon on in the Gulf of Mexico, and I want to compare that to the East Coast just briefly. The East Coast has much more salt marsh, and it has about 224. This is Kennedy's work in 2014, about 224 teragrams, which is much more than the Gulf of Mexico in terms of marshes, but much less in terms of mangroves, about 1/100th of the amount of the mangroves. And the seagrass in the East Coast, the eastern seaboard of North America, is about a fourth of the amount of the seagrass carbon in the Gulf of Mexico, making altogether about half on the eastern seaboard as in the Gulf of Mexico. But together, there is a great deal on the eastern seaboard plus the Gulf of Mexico, which could be considered the Atlantic carbon for North America. And so here you probably can't see that at all, but it's in the slides which you can download. And so we've just gone region by region, and you find that Mexico is, of course, dominant and dominated by mangroves. The seagrass is very low, the marsh are very low, and altogether the mangroves are totally dominant in this area of Mexico, whereas Florida is dominated by the seagrass, both in the upper part of Florida. The salt marshes are the dominant, but almost the same as the seagrass. Whereas in the oil patch, if you will, between the Mississippi River and southern Texas, the seagrasses have been decimated about 70%, and here in Louisiana, about to 10% of their original, whereas the salt marshes are the dominant blue carbon vegetation form throughout what we could call the oil patch here. So now we're going to hear the excellent work of Jorge Lopez-Portillo at the University of Veracruz in Jalapa. Jorge?
All right, and I'll pass the controls over to you, Jorge. And as I do that, I would just like to have a quick point of clarification for our participants who may be unfamiliar with some of the terms like teragram. So Jorge, if you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 1 teragram is equivalent to about 1 million metric tons. I just want to be able to put some of those amounts into perspective. So with that, I'll pass it back to Jorge.
It's correct. 1 teragram is 1 million, as you said. So it's 1,000 megagrams. Okay. I will speak about the Gulf of Mexico mangroves. This is only one of the types of mangroves that you will see. There are several communities formed by a very small number of species, 4 of them in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm showing you here in these yellow dots the sampling sites in the state of Veracruz, which is right in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. And this area occupies more or less 6 degrees of latitude. And we went with soil corers and tried to get as deep as we could. In this case, we present this slide images that you can actually where you can actually see wood and roots of the mangrove. This wood seems very as normal wood, but if you can press it with the finger, and that's because it has more than 2,000 years of age. With these soil covers, we can get very deep. In this case, you're looking at a sample of 3.5 meters in the mangrove in the zone of Tecolutla, which you can see here. It's a estuary, and this bar is showing that about 10% is represented by the above ground biomass, and 90% is represented by the below ground biomass. And that below 2 meters of depth, you have 34% of the biomass. That means that this carbon has been kept for long periods of time. Our radiometric age for this special site here is 3,870 years before present. So that means that more or less for the depth that we are obtaining, we get 1 millimeter per year. The mangrove forests have been in the same place then for 387 years. But there are other places that we took in the mangrove of Tecolutla here, and some of them are very big in content of carbon, and some others just begin to lose the carbon at about 1.5 meters of depth. There's another mangrove site that is called La Mancha in Veracruz, right in the center of the state. And this one can have 1,700 years or 2,000 years of age, and an accumulation of 900 megagrams per hectare. So the blue carbon source in La Mancha are from 400 to 1,200 megagrams. That depends on the geomorphological set of the mangrove. This is a show of all the 16 sites that I showed you in the first slide, and it just shows the way the organic carbon is accumulating. The slope can be very slight, or there can be a very high slope. Normally, if the slope is very high, then we will have a cumulative blue carbon that is relatively low, and the ones that have a highest are the ones where the slope decreases slightly. But anyway, from these 16 sites, we can get a general slope, and that would mean that we get 0.21 slope, or that means that the carbon accumulates in that rate. There is also great variability along the sites that we measured. It depends on the whether it is very more to the temperate side than to the southern, more tropical sites. But in general, you can see that even in the northern sites, you get a lot of contribution of carbon in sites, or very small. And this depends on the depth of the let's call it a carbon trap, and that itself is a consequence of the geomorphological site that we are sampling. Here we can see the amount of trees, the amount of carbon given by trees by liter. That is almost not possible to see. Downwood and the roots, which are the red dots here. And we are presenting the organic carbon and the inorganic carbon. So the contribution here is not as great as the organic carbon, but we could expect that in sites where there's karstic environment, like in the peninsula of Yucatan, which is mostly of calcareous origin, you would get more inorganic soil there. And overall, we can then calculate what is the percentage of cover of the three vegetation ecosystems, and of course, biological ecosystems in general that we have sampled up till now, which are the mangroves, the seagrasses, and the marshes. And you can see that mangroves have 395,000, whereas USA has 255,000. And I'll leave those, those big numbers on the left aside just to talk about the percentages. From mangroves, Mexico has 61%, whereas USA has 39%. And then you see that all the numbers in USA are bigger than those in Mexico. 2% of grasses, which this value, as Anitra was saying, will probably increase as more is known about seagrasses, especially in the Caribbean. And then the marshes will not change much because this is more a community of temperate affinity. And with respect to blue carbon, we have about 57% in Mexico and 43% in USA concerning mangroves, and then again 98% and 93%, and in average a total of 74% teragrams of blue carbon in the USA compared to Mexico. Yes, so with that I will leave, these estimates cannot be finished for the Gulf of Mexico, cannot be finished until we know what is the amount of Cuba. This paper by Osland and collaborators shows that Cuba has about 4,700 hectares, whereas USA and Mexico have 53,000, 386,000. That means that Cuba accounts for 6.9 the mangrove coverage in the Gulf of Mexico. This will change in about that amount, the contribution of mangroves, and let's see what happens with seagrasses particularly. So now I will leave this presentation to Anita.
Okay, do I have the mic back? Hello?
Yes, you're on. Thanks, Anitra.
Good, okay. So Jordan Barr with David Ho did a wonderful job in the Everglades National Park of looking at the flux, and I think it's very interesting. One of the big questions, of course, the whole study brought up more questions than answers. And here is the lower southeast part of the Everglades Shark River, very famous part. And so gathering carbon from the sawgrass and other epiphytic and other vegetation, it's full of high carbon, the river is coming out. And as it goes into the mangrove fringe, which is many miles across between the ocean and, well, the Gulf of Mexico, of course, and the salt marshes in the middle, you see that the mangroves are absorbing, and there's a sharp drop in the carbon, and the mangroves seem to be filtering out or otherwise interacting with the carbon, so that by the time the stream gets to the Shark River, gets to the Gulf of Mexico, it's quite low in carbon. And this study was done. Okay, I'm trying to.
Next.
Once more, I'm trying to. There we go. So this were their numbers, and in general, the mangroves in the Everglades take from the atmosphere about 1,000 grams of carbon per meter square, of which they put 22% into the sediment, and the net primary productivity takes up 3/4 of that 1,000. The question is, how much then is exported into the Gulf of Mexico? And depending on which of their equations that they use and which assumptions, David Ho and Jordan Barr say 25%, or it could be as high as 78%. It's probably closer to the 25%. A lot of it is, of course, used by the tremendous animal community that is associated with the Everglades. So am I in charge of these, or are you? Next slide, Jorge, if you're in charge. Thank you. So this is just a flux estimate. We were hoping to do an entire flux amount, but then we realized that we really didn't have good phytoplankton measurements in the estuaries or on the shelves that were equivalent to the carbon estimates we had for the mangrove marsh and seagrass. So we backpedaled on this, but you can see here the mangroves are the large flux of materials, except in the Louisiana marshes, where there is 3.1 teragrams that goes per year out of the Louisiana marshes into the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. I think we're going backwards. Yeah, we need to go. So if I were to sum this up, I think that, number one, we have gone estuary by estuary and tried to get the best carbon estimate for that estuary. We have excellent extent data, which has been taken by a variety of people depending which state or the country of Mexico. But we have lesser data in terms of not knowing what the whole estuary looks like, but at least having some measurements in various estuaries. So we didn't try to take a number for extent and multiply it by an average number for the carbon. We actually summed estuary by estuary for each of them around the whole Gulf of Mexico. And we find that productivity in the winter is very high in the south, that is below South Texas and below Tampa Bay in Florida. And the seagrass was particularly productive, as were, of course, the mangroves. The mangroves partly because of the heat, as well as the equatorial influx of carbon dioxide in the seawater. And the winter marshes cut back, but in general, the marshes in the north are the dominant blue carbon, which is sequestering carbon. And in the south, it's the mangrove. And there's a big exchange of other materials as well as carbon. And there is strict regulation, at least in many of the states. But nevertheless, before those regulations went in place, sometime in the 1970s, there were millions of hectares of marshes, mangroves, seagrass, which were impacted. And now we have techniques, good techniques, to restore almost all of them. And this is a place of prime importance because of its intense carbon. Next slide. Here, Jorge, yes, okay. So our conclusions were that the mangroves were the dominant force of sequestration in the Gulf of Mexico, unlike the Atlantic or the Pacific coasts of North America, where marshes are predominantly the large sequestration force. Second, seagrass were all over the place, temperate, subtropical, and tropical, but they had much less sequestration, about half, and also they had been highly impacted. And the marshes strictly dominated in Louisiana, Florida, and Texas. everything throughout the basin, including the Mexican oil industry, the Mexican shipping industry, the Texas industries, and the Florida tourism and building, as well as near the mouth of the Mississippi River, is highly anthropogenically affected and intense, and becoming more intense. So this is the sad part that we're all aware of, is that we have a huge loss of the carbon, and we have a huge loss of the blue carbon habitat throughout. So, Jorge, if you have some more things you would like to add, but those are my, the questions is, why is the Gulf of Mexico so different from the Atlantic? The next question is, how does so much carbon bury itself in the estuaries, and what buries itself on the shelves, which are extensive throughout the area, from the phytoplankton and other sources? And is the region of the Gulf of Mexico a source or a sink of atmospheric and oceanic carbon? This is the first estimate that we have of the Gulf of Mexico extent that is detailed, that is estuary by estuary. The others just waved their arms and multiplied two amounts together. But I think the reason is we have shallower estuaries in the Gulf of Mexico with a slow flow through the estuaries and a long residence time. After the hurricanes in Texas, it took months for all the low salinity water to get out. The rivers tend to spread out and pass over the seagrass and the marsh and the mangrove, and the coastal lagoons allow for protected development of wetlands and long-term accumulation. The whole thing is an enclosed basin, and it keeps the carbon. And in the area of Mexico where Jorge is, it's a hurricane shadow, so they do not have the big catastrophic events washing out carbon on a yearly basis the way the Florida Keys or Florida Bay does. And Mexico, of course, is getting all of its equatorial Atlantic upwelling carbon dioxide, as well as a lot of Saharan dust and the Mississippi River, which are 2-3 important sources of carbon. So I think that's about it. If Jorge may have a few last words. Jorge, do you?
Not really, Anitra. I think you rounded it very well. I would like to hear questions or any other comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both, and Jorge. I really appreciate the way that you were able to present this data as something that's not static, but that's still developing, especially as more and more research has been. And I think that really stresses continuing. With that, we go to some
Cannot listen to you, Stephanie.
questions. And while our panelists are answering questions, I'll put their information. Sure, absolutely. Jorge, Anitra?
Well, I was just wanted to say that 1 teragram is 1 million tons. Did I say it correctly? Yeah. Just to be clear. If there's a,
Yes.
I could not hear anything of what you said. I don't know if
Thank you. And sorry.
Other listeners were aware of what you were mentioning.
I can't hear the questioner.
No worries. And I
can hear Stephanie. I hear Jorge, but I don't hear the questioner.
Sorry about that. I had a little connectivity issue there for a minute. Sorry, the question was, any idea how long elevated carbon storage of restored seagrass beds remain compared to natural seagrass beds?
It
Did that
appears,
come through, Anitra?
yes. Can you hear me? I'm
Yes.
talking. It appears that there is a similar amount of, when you look at the sediment profile, that there's a similar sediment profile, and that the natural seagrass gets older and gets less dense somewhat, whereas a very dense restoring seagrass occurs after about 3-4 months. So I would imagine that if we look down 1 meter into the sediment, you're going to find a very similar situation. You can see clearly when you take your core, the area which has been impacted and the time sequence which has been impacted, where there's no carbon at all. It's just white or yellow sand, and then the carbon starts over again. And it matches quite well to the natural in that same area. That's the best answer I could give at this point.
Great, thank you, Anitra. And apologies for listeners if you're having connectivity issues or you're not hearing us properly. Feel free to follow up after the webinar. Let's try to get to at least one more question, kind of a follow-up question, I think, for Jorge. Have you or anyone visited Cuba to examine the health of mangroves there?
Oh, but there is a researcher in the paper that by Mike Osland that is working actually in Cuba. He's a Cuban. So if you're interested in getting more information about that place, I could contact you with him. That's my answer.
I have visited
so
Cuba,
I don't see any more questions at this time.
Decades ago. Can you hear me, Stephanie?
Yes, thank you, Anitra.
Yeah, I visited Cuba in terms of the seagrasses, that the urban impact and the port and shoreline impact is quite intense. However, you get to the areas which are outlying so that there hasn't been the same development level, and then they're quite natural. They're like Belize or Honduras or something. So they're very different situations of the seagrass depending where you are in Cuba.
Thanks, and hopefully we'll be having more opportunities to have additional information from Cuba and other regions, other parts of the Gulf. So I don't see any more questions entered in the question box at this time. So we'll go ahead and close this webinar for today. Again, we will have a recording of this session posted online shortly, and I do encourage you to reach out to us with additional questions or ideas for future webinars. So Anitra and Jorge, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your research with us.
Thank you
for inviting us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Goodbye.